There are stories that touch your heart, and then there are stories that completely shake the walls around your soul. This is one of those stories. Not because it's filled with perfect moments or easy victories, but because it is built on real pain, real rejection, and a real decision. A decision to rise when it would have been easier to disappear. Imagine being called the world's ugliest woman by strangers who knew nothing about your heart, your spirit, or your worth. Imagine being told you didn't deserve love, happiness, or even life, just because you look different. That was her introduction to the world. A child born with a rare syndrome, a life without body fat, and a body the world refused to understand. But she didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for applause. She asked herself one thing: who gets to define me? The world tried to name her a monster, but she rewrote the label. She decided her identity would not be the insult. It would be the impact. Her story doesn't just break your heart. It forces you to open it, because inside every moment that could have ended her is a lesson about becoming unbreakable. They threw words at her like weapons, but she didn't let them pierce her soul. Because she knew deep down this life wasn't about being accepted by the loudest voices in the room. It was about finding peace in her own reflection. The names they called her were crueler than most would believe. Ugly, monster, thing, and yet she stood. Every insult could have been a reason to hide, to shrink, to surrender to the shadows. But she refused. She walked back into the light, bruised but not broken. And because even when the world said she wasn't enough, she whispered to herself, I am still worthy. She didn't need the world's approval to believe in her purpose. Cruelty never became her compass. It wasn't the story she chose to live by. She rewrote the narrative others tried to place upon her. While others saw her difference as a flaw, she began to recognize it as her power. She didn't silence her voice just because they didn't understand her. Instead, she let it grow stronger, wiser, fuller. She took the pain and turned it into poetry. She took rejection and turned it into revelation. And in doing so, she gave permission to others, permission to love themselves, to fight for their voice, to never let someone else's opinion become the definition of their worth. Cruelty could have crushed her, but she transformed it. With every scar, she chose strength. With every moment she was mocked, she chose meaning, because real power isn't found in perfection. It's born in the decision to rise when it would be easier to retreat. And she rose, again and again, until even those who once laughed had to listen, until those who once pointed began to praise. Until the name they tried to shame became the name they looked up to. You see, she knew something most people forget. You are not the worst thing someone has ever said about you. You are not your diagnosis. You are not your scars. You are not the laugh that echoed after your fall. You are not the comment section. You are not the rejection. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become through it. And she chose to become hope. She chose to become strength. She chose to become someone whose life made others believe again. So when they tried to define her by cruelty, she gave them something more powerful. Kindness. Not weakness. Powerful, defiant kindness, the kind that says, you can try to break me, but I will only rise wiser. That's who she became. That's who she still is. And that same power, that same choice, that same fire, it lives in you too. You don't need the world's permission to be unstoppable. You don't need everyone to understand you to make a difference. You don't need to hide one more day to make others comfortable. You just need to remember what she remembered. Cruelty isn't the end of your story. It's just the part where your strength begins. They talked over her. Louder, sharper, meaner, as if raising their volume could bury her existence, as if her silence would mean their words were truth. But what they didn't realize was that she was listening. Not to believe them, but to understand just how much noise fear makes when it doesn't know how to face strength. She sat in rooms where her voice was dismissed before she even spoke. She entered spaces where assumptions preceded understanding. But she didn't let that be the end. She didn't let that be her. Because there comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, but a quiet turning point in the heart. When a girl stops needing to match the volume around her and starts honoring the power within her. And that moment came. She realized she didn't need to shout to be heard. She just needed to speak. Even if her voice trembled, even if her truth made others uncomfortable, even if standing up meant standing alone, she chose her voice. Not because it was the easiest path. Not because it was the easiest path, but because it was hers. Their volume had always tried to shape her, telling her who she should be, how she should look, what she should say. But she began to understand something that changed everything. Volume isn't the same as value. Just because they were louder didn't mean they were right. Just because they were many didn't mean they were wise. Just because they echoed didn't mean she had to absorb it. So she stopped trying to compete with their noise and started listening to her own truth. And it was there, in that sacred space of self-respect, that she found her courage. Her voice wasn't designed to blend. It was born to break through. So she began to use it, not for approval, not for applause, but for purpose. To say what needed to be said. To share what others were afraid to admit. To stand for those who still hadn't found their own voice. She didn't wait until she had the perfect words. She spoke with honesty. She didn't wait until the world was ready. She spoke when her soul was. And slowly, the world had to adjust. Because one whisper of truth will always carry more weight than 1,000 shouts of cruelty. Her voice became her revolution. Not because it was loud, but because it was authentic. She began to rewrite what it meant to speak. Not just to say something, but to mean it, to live it, to be it. Her voice wasn't just in her mouth. It was in her eyes, her walk, her story, her scars. She didn't fight back with hatred. She fought back with honesty. She didn't try to drown their noise. She rose above it. Because when you truly know who you are, you don't have to be the loudest in the room. You just have to be real. And real will echo farther than noise ever could. And noise ever could. The ones who used to try to silence her began to see her differently. Not because she changed to fit them, but because she changed in spite of them. She owned her voice, and with it, she lit a path for others. People who thought they were alone in their pain. People who were told they were too much or not enough. People who believed their voice didn't matter. She became the proof that it does. And maybe you're standing where she once stood, surrounded by noise, opinions, pressure to stay small. Maybe you've been taught that being quiet is safer, that going along is easier. But I promise you this. Your voice is not a threat. It's a light. It's the sound of resilience. It's the music of survival. It's the power to choose love in a world that often chooses fear. And when you speak, not to please, but to stand, you set others free too. She chose her voice over their volume. And that choice changed everything. It didn't make the noise go away. It didn't mean people stopped judging. But it meant she stopped shrinking. It meant she stopped shrinking. It meant she stopped apologizing. It meant she showed up fully, flaws, fire and all. And here's the miracle. Once she stopped begging to be heard, she began to be felt. Not just in words, but in impact. Not just in moments, but in legacies. She became more than a voice. She became a movement. And so can you. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more truth. And your voice, no matter how long it's been buried, is still powerful. Still sacred, thought the world was always kind to her. In fact, most days it didn't even pretend to be. It tended to be. It threw stares at her before it threw compassion. It whispered behind her back and laughed in front of her face. It looked at her and decided she was broken before she ever had the chance to speak. But what the world never saw, what the world never expected, was what she saw when she looked in the mirror and chose not to wait. She chose not to wait for their apologies. Not to wait for their permission. Not to wait for their acceptance. Because the waiting room of life can become a prison if you sit too long hoping someone will finally see your worth. She stopped waiting, and she started becoming, people told her. Just hang in there, maybe they'll be nicer one day. Just ignore them, eventually it'll pass. Just wait, your time will come. But she realized that maybe, eventually, and someday were just ways the world tried to keep her quiet. Just another form of delay wrapped in false hope. And she had already wasted enough time waiting for someone else to tell her It was okay to love herself. So she stood up, not because she felt strong, but because she was tired of being small. She stood up for the girl inside her who deserved a life, not just survival. She didn't wait for the world to change. She changed her world. She began by shifting the conversations in her own mind. She stopped repeating their cruel words and started writing her own. She stopped asking, "Why me?" and started saying, "Watch me." And with every small decision to believe in herself, her world began to shift. Not because the outside suddenly softened, but because her inside grew stronger. She painted her life with the colors they said didn't suit her. She built dreams out of the rubble of rejection. She smiled, and not because life was easy, but because she refused to let pain steal her joy. She realized her greatest power was never in controlling how others treated her, but in how she responded. She didn't need a perfect world to find peace. She just needed a healed perspective. So she took ownership of her worth, of her identity, of her journey. No more waiting for society to evolve. No more hoping the bullies would become kind. No more expecting the culture to suddenly embrace what it never understood. Her freedom wasn't in them changing, it was in her choosing. And she chose to live fully, even in a world that wanted her to dim. No. She didn't rewrite the entire world, but she rewrote the one she lived in. She created boundaries where there were none. She walked away from spaces that made her feel less. She stopped trying to fit in where she wasn't seen, and built a life where she stood out with pride. And the more she honored her truth, the more the right people found her. Not the loudest, not the most popular, but the most real, and suddenly, her world wasn't so lonely anymore. She began lifting others, not because she had it all figured out, but because she knew what it felt like to be crushed by silence. She shared her story not for sympathy, but to build bridges for others still stuck in shame. Her pain became her platform. Her healing became her message. And her voice, trembled as it was, echoed into lives she would never meet in ways she could never imagine. They said one person can't change the world. Maybe they were right. But one person can change a world. And she did, by believing in her beauty before the world labeled her enough. And by choosing kindness even when cruelty was easier. By loving her life, even when it didn't look like anyone else's. She redefined what it means to be powerful. Not loud, not flawless, not perfect, but present, whole, authentic. That was her power. And it grew, not overnight, not without setbacks, but steadily, like a flame that refuses to go out. And maybe you feel like she once did, waiting, wondering, wishing the world would just be different. Just a little softer, a little kinder, a little safer. But hear this, you don't have to wait. You don't have to delay your healing until others understand your pain. You don't have to pause your joy until the crowd claps for you. You can change your world starting with your voice, your choices, your truth. It starts small, with one decision to believe you're worthy. One moment of standing tall when everything tells you to shrink. One act of courage when silence feels easier. And with each of those moments, your world begins to shift. The pain doesn't vanish, but you become stronger than it. The noise doesn't disappear, but your peace becomes louder than their volume. She proved it. Every day, she woke up in a world that wasn't built for her. And she built anyway. She loved anyway. She loved anyway. She dreamed anyway. And now, her world doesn't just exist. It thrives. Not because the world changed, but because she did. And that kind of change, that kind of power, it can change everything for you, for others, for generations. So don't wait. Become Some stories aren't meant to be watched from afar. They are mirrors, not windows. This story, her story, was never only about her. It was a light shining on the shadows we hide in. A hand reaching out from the rubble of rejection, from the ashes of a not enough, and saying, "Come on, we rise from here." When she stood, every person who had ever been told they were too different, too broken, too much, or too little, saw themselves in her. Because when one person dares to be unshakably themselves, it gives silent permission for 1,000 others to exhale and do the same. Her scars weren't just hers. They were shared. Her healing wasn't just personal, it was contagious. And the strength didn't just lift her, it lifted all of us. She looked out into the world and knew she wasn't here to make sense to it. She was here to make a mark on it. And so are you. And the beauty of this story is that it's still being written every time you choose to rise above the labels, every time you speak, even when your voice shakes, every time you love yourself without needing anyone else's permission to do so. Her story now lives in every different child who walks taller. In every heart that refuses to cave to cruelty. In every soul that dares to believe they are more than the world has ever told them. You see, her victory was never meant to be hers alone. It was meant to awaken yours. So walk away from this story, not just moved, but moved to act, to speak, to heal, to rise. Because this isn't just her story, it's yours too. It would have been easier to listen to the hate, when thousands of people online laughed at her pain, mocked her appearance, and said things no human should hear. She had a choice, either become what they said, or become something greater. She chose greater. The strength didn't come from never crying. It came from crying and rising anyway. She learned how to look in the mirror and speak her truth louder than their lies. And she didn't do it by pretending it did. She did it by deciding that their words would not have the final word. Every one of us faces criticism, some loud, some subtle. But you get to decide if the voices around you are louder than the voice within you. She proved that even if the world misunderstands your story, it cannot erase your value. Cruelty may visit, but it never has to stay. The story she began to write was not about how broken she felt. It was about how bravely she rebuilt. There is a quiet war between being silent to be safe and being loud to be free. She chose freedom. And the day she stood on the stage and told her truth, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who's ever felt unseen, unwanted, or unloved. Her voice cracked up in a world of healing, not only for herself, but for millions who didn't have the words yet. She turned rejection into a reason. She made pain her platform. That's the moment she stopped being someone they mocked and became someone the world admired. She taught us that your voice matters more than their volume. The crowd might be loud, but your truth is stronger. You don't have to yelp to be powerful. You just have to be honest. And her honesty became light in places people only saw darkness. She didn't wait to be invited. She created space. And now that space holds stories that matter. The world said her pain made her weak, but she realized it was the exact thing that made her powerful. Because when you walk through fire and still choose to love, when you've been hated and still choose to hope, when you've been stared at and still choose to show up, you are powerful beyond measure. She took the very thing meant to break her and turned it into a message that builds people every day. Her story became medicine. And the beautiful part is she didn't need to become someone else to do it. She needed to become more of herself. That's the key. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be real. And the most real parts of you, the ones shaped by struggle, are often the parts that will set others free. Her pain had a purpose, not because it was fair, but because she refused to let it be wasted, that too many people are waiting for permission to live fully. Waiting for the critics to stop, waiting for the pain to feel ready. But she didn't wait. She started where she was, with what she had. And it was more than enough, because when you stop waiting and start living, that's when healing begins. She filled the silence with purpose. She filled the rejection with meaning. And because she moved first, the world began to move too. Today, she's not just a survivor. She's a trailblazer. She didn't just rise above the hate. She turned it into highways for healing. She made the broken pieces into bridges. Her world didn't change by accident. It changed because she changed. And that change gave others the courage to start their own. Because you may not look like her or speak like her, but you felt the same pain. You've stood in front of a mirror and wondered if you were enough. You've heard the whispers that tried to define you, but this is where it ends. Today, her story becomes a mirror, and it shows you something powerful. You are already worthy, already chosen, already enough. Your story might be messy. Your story might be visible or hidden, but they are not shameful. They are sacred. Let this story break what needs to be broken, old beliefs, old wounds, old lies, and let it build you into something new. Stronger, softer, braver, bolder. Her voice was once silenced, but now it goes with healing. So will yours. Will yours.